Hello everyone, my name is Sarah and today we are going to be reading a pretty tricky article, so make sure that your brain is fully ready for the challenge before we start. So are any of you perhaps interested in medical science or even the development of new medicines and drugs? Okay, well if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in, you will probably find this article to be very interesting. However, just warning you in advance, there are some pretty challenging vocabulary words in here that are very specialized to the medical field, so just try to pay attention as I attempt to help you guys follow along. Alright, so we're going to go through this article one sentence at a time. Ready? Korea-based pharmaceutical company Celltrion announced on August 14th that it is beginning a phase 1 clinical trial for CT-P41. It's Denosumab Prolia biosimilar. Okay, so I will admit, when I was doing research for this topic, there are some words in here that I also did not know. So don't panic if you think this looks really difficult. We're going to explain it. Okay, so first of all, a pharmaceutical company, I guess in Korean you could probably say like a 제약사. So it's a company that makes drugs and medicine that people can use to treat diseases. So a pharmaceutical company in Korea called Celltrion announced recently that it is beginning a phase 1 clinical trial. So a clinical trial is when they test a medicine to see if it works and if it's safe for people to use. So it's basically like an experiment, except it's done usually within a company, and usually for medical purposes. Okay, so Celltrion, they said that they're going to do a clinical trial for Denosumab Biosimilar. Okay, so Denosumab is it's the scientific name of a drug called Prolia. And this drug Prolia, it is really expensive to get, so what this company is doing is they're developing a biosimilar. So because Prolia, it's a biologic drug, it's made using living systems like cells. So a biosimilar, it's kind of like the generic drug version of this name brand drug Prolia. So we're going to explain it a little bit more as we go on, so just stay patient with me. Yeah, there's some tricky stuff in this article, but you will learn a lot. I definitely learned a lot. Okay. Denosumab, better known by its trade name Prolia, is a human monoclonal antibody for the treatment of osteoporosis, metastases to bone, and giant cell tumors of bone. Okay, as you can see by the number of colors that I used on this slide, there are quite a few tricky medical terms. So these 4 words, it's basically just Latin. So it's okay if you don't know those words. We're gonna review them one at a time. Okay, so first of all, a trade name is basically the brand name of something. So like, for instance, if I wanted to buy a vacuum cleaner, but I wanted to buy it from the company Dyson, then like the Dyson HX43, that would be its trade name, because that is what it's known by when you go to buy it. However, most drugs also have a generic name, which tells you what the active ingredient, which makes the medicine work, is called. And so in this case, this drug, which is normally known by its trade name Prolia, its official scientific name is Denosumab. So you don't actually have to know how to pronounce that word. I did not know how to pronounce that word before I made this video. But if you're interested in medicine, it might be a good word to be able to recognize. So what exactly is Prolia or Denosumab? Well, it's a human monoclonal antibody. So a monoclonal antibody is a laboratory-produced molecule that can restore, enhance, or mimic the immune system's response. So some people, when they're really sick, their immune system is not working properly. So this drug, it's mimicking, it's copying what the immune system is supposed to do, because the body is not capable of making those antibodies on its own. And monoclonal, that just means that so if you split it into two parts, there's mono and clonal, right? So mono means one, and clonal means, well, to clone or to copy. So basically, this drug, Prolia or Denosumab, it's a copy of one cell that has been multiplied in a laboratory, and that's why it's called monoclonal. And antibodies are the things inside of our immune systems that fight off diseases and protect us from getting sick. So basically, to make things a little simple, Denosumab or Prolia, they're the same thing. It is a lab-produced antibody that it helps your immune system respond to certain illnesses. And some of these illnesses are osteoporosis, metastases to bone, and giant cell tumors of bone. So osteoporosis, this is another Latin word, and you can also split it into two parts, osteo and porosis. So porosis, it looks a little bit like the word pore in English, right? So pore, it can mean like the little tiny holes in your face where oil and water comes out. It can mean, it's used in some other contexts. So pores, it connotates little tiny holes. And then osteo, that means bone. So basically, osteoporosis is a disease where you get holes inside of your bone. It looks kind of like a honeycomb or the inside of a beehive. And this happens when your body is not producing enough bone, or you're losing bone more rapidly than you're producing it. So yes, it's a pretty serious illness. I've heard it can be very painful. So this drug, Denosumab or Prolia, can potentially help osteoporosis patients get treated. So another disease that this drug can treat is called metastases to bone or giant cell tumors of bone. And both of these are forms of cancer. So metastases, that basically means that the cancer has spread from where it originally started, and now it's moved on to other parts of your body. A lot of the times, because our entire body is full of bones, what will happen is even if you have breast cancer or liver cancer, like cancer in any part of your body, it will actually grow and then latch on to your bone. And in that case, that little thing, the cancer cells that are attached to your bone, those are called metastases to bone. And then there's also another type of cancer called giant cell tumors of bone. So yeah, thank you guys so much for your patience in explaining all these very difficult words. You guys are amazing if you are following this. So let's move on to the next sentence. The brand name drug costs about $1,300 or 1.5 million won per 6-month dose. This does not include the cost of the copays paid at the doctor's office for each visit, which can be $100 or more each time. So maybe to those of you who have lived in Korea your whole lives, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but this is because the American insurance system and the Korean system work very, very different from each other. So in the United States, where I'm from, medical care is very expensive. Insurance is also very expensive, and the coverage is not so good. So what happens is, even if you have a disease like osteoporosis, metastases to bone, or giant cell tumors, you still have to pay a lot of times for your own treatment. And it's really sad. A lot of people go into debt. They lose their life savings because of an illness. It's kind of sad situation. And to make things worse, on top of all the other fees, the chemotherapy, the other things that people do to treat cancer, this drug to treat osteoporosis, Prolia, it costs $1,300 twice every single year. So that's a lot of money, right? Especially if you're not able to work because you're sick, that's a lot of money. And a lot of people can't really afford it. On top of that, when you go to, you can't just get drugs from the store whenever you want, right? Especially these kinds of very specialized medical products. So every time that you want to buy this drug from the pharmacy, you have to get a prescription from the doctor, right? And that also costs money. When you go to the doctor, you have to pay a copay, that's basically the money that you pay upfront at the doctor's office. And in the United States, a pretty normal copay is around $100, and this is oftentimes not covered by insurance. So even if your insurance does cover this $1,300 fee every 6 months, you still might have to pay $100 every month just to get the care and the drugs and the treatment that you need. So it's a pretty expensive and complicated situation, and when you're sick, you don't want to be dealing with this, right? So the company that we talked about earlier, they're trying to solve this problem. In order to reduce the cost of care for those with Prolia prescriptions, Celltrion aims to complete phase 3 trials by next year and commercialize CT-P41 when Prolia's US substance patent expires in February 2015. So in the last slide, we talked about how expensive and stressful medical treatment is, right? So basically what this company is trying to do is reduce the cost of care. So make it cheaper for people who need Prolia prescriptions. That's the little note that you get from the doctor that you take to the pharmacy when you need a special kind of medicine. They're trying to reduce the cost of care for those who need Prolia prescriptions. And so what they want to do, basically, is they want to commercialize their biosimilar, the thing that we talked about earlier. They want to commercialize it. They want to sell it for money after Prolia's patent expires in 2025. So like a lot of different types of inventions, I'm sure this remote probably has a patent somewhere. This television probably has a patent somewhere. And these patents, they're supposed to protect the intellectual property of people who invent things or make things. And it's the same exact thing for pharmaceutical companies. Because usually when you're developing a new treatment or a new medication to treat a certain disease, it takes a lot of money up front, right? There's a lot of research, you have to pay the scientists, you have to get a lab, it's very, very expensive. So a lot of times, and also these companies, they have to make money in order to continue doing their research, right? So what happens is a lot of times name brand drugs such as Prolia, for quite a long time, they're sold for a very high price. And that makes it hard for people who have these diseases in order to access them. However, according to US law, the patent for medical products expires after a certain amount of time. I think it might be 50 years. And so Prolia's patent is going to expire in February 2025. And what happens once that patent expires, that means that other companies, such as Celltrion, the one that we referred to earlier, they can make basically a copy of the drug, in this case Prolia, and sell it for a lower price because they didn't have to do the research themselves, right? Okay, so what exactly is a biosimilar? I had the same question when I was assigned this topic, so hopefully I can explain it in a way that makes sense. Biosimilars are sometimes compared to generic drugs, such as acetaminophen, which is the generic form of the pain and fever reliever Tylenol. These are drugs with identical active ingredients as brand name drugs sold for a lower price. Okay, So first of all, a generic drug. So how many of you have ever bought Tylenol at the store? Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty effective pain reliever and fever reliever, right? But actually, when you spend money on the name brand Tylenol, you are basically buying just the fancy packaging, because literally it is exactly the same as acetaminophen, and that's the generic form of Tylenol. So as we discussed earlier, branded name drugs, their patent expires after a certain amount of time, right? So other companies can make drugs or medicines with the exact same ingredients. It's literally chemically identical. And those are called generic drugs. So if you ask a doctor what they buy for their child, they're almost never going to buy Tylenol for their own family, because they know that acetaminophen, which is just the plain old, no fancy labeling drug, you can buy it anywhere, it's literally exactly the same, and often it's much cheaper than the name brand Tylenol. Yeah. So biosimilars, they're like generic drugs, but they're not quite exactly the same, and we're going to explain that in the next slide. Biosimilars can be thought of as the generic alternative to biologic drugs, which are vaccines, cell and gene therapies, transplant tissues, and other products produced from living organisms. So there's tons of stuff happening inside of our body. Some of it is just, atoms and molecules. I'm not a scientist, I'm so sorry. But there are also a lot of little teeny tiny living things inside of our body that are not exactly like the same organism as us. And so if a pharmaceutical company, a company that makes medicine, wants to make something that can mimic the role that, for instance, the microbiome or certain antibodies or certain proteins do, they have to use material that is produced from living organisms, because you can't just create life in a lab yet, anyway. So biosimilars, it's basically the same as a generic drug, but generic drugs, they're not alive, right? There's nothing living inside of them. It's just chemicals that you can get from the ground or develop inside of a lab. So biosimilars, they're like generic drugs, but they're not quite the same. And so generic drugs, they're based on the active ingredient. In this case, it's acetaminophen. And then biosimilars, they're based on biologic drugs. So this is like the name brand version of a drug or therapy or treatment that uses living organisms inside of it. And some of these include vaccines. It's probably the most common, most famous one, because you can't, usually a vaccine, it's a weakened version of the real illness, right? So to a certain extent, so virus particles can also be considered a component for biologic drugs. They're not quite the same as just, gold or silver or hydrogen floating around. Yeah, all right. Did that help? I really hope so. And then tissues. So there's multiple meanings for this word. One word that you might be thinking of is literally like a paper tissue that you would use to wipe your face or your nose. But tissue, it can also mean like meat, basically, on your body. So it's something coming from a living thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a human. That's usually what people think of, though, in this sort of situation. And then an organism is just any living thing. Okay. You guys still here? All right. We're good. We got this. We're going to get through this. While generic medicines are chemically synthesized, biosimilars must be grown within complex living systems. Because of this, biosimilars are unlikely to be exact copies of the reference products. So we just talked about how generic medicines and name brand medicines like Tylenol and acetaminophen, they're literally the exact same thing, just with different packaging, and that's required because of the FDA rules. But it's a little bit more tricky when it comes to biologic drugs and biosimilars. Because when something is alive, or if it has some kind of genetic material, every time that it reproduces, something is going to be a little bit different, right? So the main two differences between a generic drug and a biosimilar is that biosimilars, they're made of cells or particles from living things, while generic medicines are not. And also, because of this, biosimilars, they can't always be exactly the same as the thing that they're copied from. Because again, it's really difficult and complicated to make an exact clone many times. Despite this, in order to be approved for distribution, biosimilars must demonstrate no clinically meaningful difference in the efficacy, safety, or potency with its reference product. So we just said a lot of times biosimilars, they're not exactly the same in the way that generic drugs and name brand drugs are supposed to be exactly the same chemically. However, that doesn't mean they can just sell whatever they want and say, oh, this is Prolia, just trust me, it's not exactly the same, but it's basically the same. That would not be an okay thing to do, right? Because, you know, it could really make some people sick. So there are some rules. So in order to be approved for distribution, so handing them out, selling them, giving them to people, sending them to hospitals, the biosimilars must demonstrate no clinically meaningful difference. So clinically meaningful, it basically, so when they do the experiments to compare the biosimilar to the reference product, in this case it's Prolia, the biosimilar drug has to be really close. It can't be exactly the same, but it has to have the exact same or almost the exact same efficacy. So does it work or not? Efficacy, it can be translated as 효과성, I think, in Korean. Safety, so this is obviously very important. Make sure it doesn't make people sick. And potency. So it has to work the way that it's supposed to. It has to be safe. And it has to be administered in the same dosage as the reference product, in this case, Prolia. If the drug passes all 3 phases of clinical trials, Celltrion's Prolia biosimilar could save osteoporosis patients thousands of dollars in medical fees every year. So it's really important that companies such as Celltrion, they continue trying to make these biosimilar or generic products, because like we said, osteoporosis, it's a really painful disease, right? And like no one wants to be suffering from that. And especially when you're sick, especially when you're in pain all the time, you don't also want to be in pain financially. So this company, if they're able to produce a biosimilar that can be sold for a lower price than Prolia, it could help a lot of people get treatment when they really need it. So it's very important work. All right, so that is our article for this week. I know that this week it was a really challenging one. So thank you all so much for your patience, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. All right, have a great day. Bye.